Hello everyone, Mark Heck coming to you from Costa Rica, which is a nice little segue into how the interior of British Columbia, Switzerland, and Costa Rica all share a rare thing in common. Now, yes, there's mountains and there's nice scenery, but one thing most people don't realize is all three have cultures that are diplomatic, which is connected to having similar geographies, which I'll get into. But I wanted to talk about this today because, well, one, I'm in Costa Rica, and two, I see a lot of people saying the interior of British Columbia and Alberta are culturally the same because they both vote conservative. Now, this is just simply not true. It's a false equivalency argument. So, I apologize right now, but as a geographer, I'm going to break some hearts with an explanation as to why the culture of interior BC is definitely not the same as Alberta, and is in fact more like Switzerland and Costa Rica. And it all begins with war and peace. Most of us, well, mostly the guys, are fascinated by wars and warriors, honor, courage, bravery, epic battles, and all that sort of stuff. We hardly ever think about the people who must fix things after the fighting. In other words, we think a lot about the warriors and very little about the peacemakers, or the diplomats. That's actually a big problem for all of us, because other than the diplomats being like an overlooked shadow, they're kind of rare, at least the really good ones that you actually want at the table when everyone's trying to come to a peace deal. They're rare because the places where diplomats come from are rare. The world is awash in warriors, almost absent in diplomats. You see, there's a general truism that flatlands of the world, the prairies, the steppes, tend to produce warriors, and there's a lot of them. The flatland phenomenon is not new, by the way. Even before Europeans arrived on the North American continent, it was the prairie Indians, the Blackfoot, the Lakota, Sioux, and so on, that had a reputation for being the most warlike of all indigenous peoples across the entire continent. That continues today. Alberta has all the signs and metrics of a warrior culture. Okay, but if the flatlands of the world produce warriors, is there a landscape that produces diplomats? Because, as long as there are wars and warriors, we're going to need diplomats. And the answer to that is yes. We know where they are likely to be because they have three important factors altogether. And those factors are, one, the place is in the middle between two or more competing regions, preferably on a trade route. Second, it will be a place that interacts with those neighboring regions, but doesn't fight them. And third, it can't be flat. When you have these three things all together, the people are kind of forced to be diplomatic and neutral. They'll tend to have an internal culture that isn't rigidly stratified, it isn't hyper-competitive, they tend to be cooperative and patient. So these people are also going to be some of the rarest people on Earth. Why? Because most of the world's population lives in a very competitive, nasty, dog-eat-dog world, which leads most people to naturally assume that power, force, manipulation, competition, corruption is how you get what you want in life. People in a diplomatic culture, by contrast, will have a totally different perspective. And the top individuals in that society, who really take on the role of the diplomat fairly seriously, will grow up studying the human condition, human psychology. They'll be selfless and able to bring together competing interests, who often want to kill each other, and then try to convince them to do something other than, well, continuing to kill each other. Now, like anyone who develops a special skill, it helps to do it in the right place at the right time. And in this case, a budding diplomat will need to grow up in a place that fosters diplomatic thinking right from a young age. So a person who lives in a warrior culture isn't going to learn these kinds of things. They're going to learn a different set of skills and have a completely different mindset. They're going to learn to be tough, how to fight, the importance of obeying hierarchies of merit and soldiering, greeting people with deference, sir, ma'am, that kind of thing. Even if the average person within a warrior culture never joins a formal military setting, they'll still absorb the warrior ethos. Even if they are, say, an accountant, a doctor, hairdresser, it doesn't matter. They'll still grow up with the warrior culture as the foundation for how they see the world. Well, Diplomatic places, with their diplomatic cultures, on the other hand, are going to be neutral. And as I said, there aren't many of them. So today I give you three. One is Switzerland. It's in the middle between competing interests, it doesn't fight with any of them, and it's definitely not flat. So it's no coincidence the world's diplomatic meeting place, the United Nations, was headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, almost 100 years ago now. A second place is here in Costa Rica. This place has always been in the middle. Prior to European conquest, this geographic region sat between two great zones of civilization. The Mesoamerican civilizations to the north, the Mayans, Aztecs, Olmecs, and so on. And the South American civilizations to the south, the Nazca, Incans, and others. Now, both civilizational areas had large, socially stratified populations which built permanent structures and monuments, some that still stand today. Now, between these two civilizational areas was the land in between, which is right here. And what's interesting here is what's missing. You won't find large monuments or ancient ruins. Why? Well, because it was in the middle. It was on a trade route. It was partly isolated by imposing mountains and not of any real interest to either of the two giants for it to ever be fought over. It was neutral ground. So the ancient people here never had a reason to build giant monuments. They did have every reason, however, to be diplomats. Now, I should point out that the boundaries of this region have changed over time. The region was arguably larger in the past than it is today. For example, Nicaragua to the north of Costa Rica was mostly part of the ancient neutral zone. But it's pretty questionable today, what with its military dictatorship that hasn't had a history of diplomacy during its entire political existence. And then there's the Panama Canal to the south, which, when it was completed in 1914, changed things down there. What we call Panama today was a neutral zone in pre-Columbian times, but has now become a place where global powers compete for control. So Panama and Nicaragua don't fit the three factors any longer, which means there's only Costa Rica left in the middle. And no surprise, Costa Rica does have a global reputation for diplomacy. So that's two places that are naturally good settings for producing diplomats, Switzerland and Costa Rica. Which brings me back around to the interior of British Columbia. Interior BC is very similar to Switzerland and Costa Rica. It has those same three factors, and it has a history to go along with it. So geographically, culturally, and academically, this place is actually referred to more as the Plateau region. It's the land between the Pacific Ocean and the prairies. Now, in the past, the indigenous people of the plateau, such as the Okanagan, the Shuswap, and some others, were always the middlemen in trade between coast and prairie. It's a vast distance between coast and prairie. It's about 1,000 kilometers roughly, which meant those in the middle had to become intermediaries. They had to be really good at trade negotiation and diplomacy. They were not slave traders, not merchants, not warriors. They were diplomats. And they were definitely not like the Prairie Indians. An Okanagan native elder named Richard Armstrong even admitted to me once, he said, "We're not like the Prairie Indians. They shoot first and ask questions later." So the tradition of diplomacy across the Plateau region has simply continued today. Although it's quite subtle, you have to look pretty closely, and I don't mean just among indigenous people. It includes everyone who grows up in the Plateau region. On the Canadian side, for example, the region has become known as a business hub for networking, and networking among a pretty diverse set of businesses. And politically, you find a lot of influential but moderate politicians that have come out of this region, more than its population size would naturally warrant. Now, I actually covered this in much more detail in a previous video, Archetypes of Alberta and BC. I'll post a link to that video at the end and in the comment section. And I also covered this in way more depth in my book, Why Europeans Naturally Invaded the New World. I'll post the link to that in the comment section as well. Okay, but suffice it to say, interior British Columbia is definitely not culturally the same as Alberta, even though they both tend to vote for political parties with the name Conservative in them. Alberta has a warrior culture like other flatlands of the world. Interior British Columbia, especially the southern interior, has a diplomatic culture like Switzerland and Costa Rica. Alberta and interior BC are polar opposites. They are the personas of war and peace writ large. Unfortunately, most people have no idea this exists, but then when you consider how few regions around the world have those three factors necessary to produce diplomats, and when you consider that a potential diplomat usually needs to grow up and live in one of these areas or these rare places, and then consider how few individuals truly master the skills needed to be effective, you end up with a general culture of diplomacy, but a short list of actual diplomats. Wars, conflicts, and trade disputes will always be common, but the people who we really need to help resolve these will always be rare. And these rare people, well, you're just not going to hear about them or from them very much. You're just not going to hear about this, except maybe from me and a few other quiet people. But if you ever need a diplomat, well, now you know where to look.